"So this is the babysitter everyone keeps talking about?" one of the mothers said with a polite smile as she reached for a cupcake from the dessert table, and my daughter-in-law laughed softly before answering. "Yes, Evelyn helps us a lot with Mason." I stood there holding a roll of silver ribbon in my hand, while the backyard I had spent 3 weeks decorating suddenly felt unfamiliar to me. The balloons swayed gently in the warm June breeze. Blue and gold streamers hung across the fence exactly the way my grandson liked them. I had rented the bounce house myself, baked 3 dozen vanilla cupcakes from scratch, and spent nearly $400 on party supplies because Mason had turned 8 only once, and I wanted the day to feel magical for him. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. The mother gave me another quick smile before walking away toward the patio where the other guests stood sipping lemonade beneath the shade umbrellas. I looked across the yard and saw Chloe greeting everyone near the entrance gate in a white sundress and oversized sunglasses, looking more like the host of a luxury brunch than the woman who had barely lifted a finger to help prepare the party. Daniel stood beside her holding a paper plate and laughing at something another father had said. Neither of them looked in my direction. I pressed the ribbon down against the gift table and forced myself to keep moving. The children were running across the grass with water balloons while Mason chased after them in a superhero cape I had sewn for him myself just 2 nights earlier. His laughter drifted across the yard, bright and innocent, completely untouched by the heaviness tightening inside my chest. "Excuse me," another guest called from behind me. "Can the babysitter help us find more juice boxes?" Babysitter. The word landed softly, almost casually, yet it cut deeper than anything shouted in anger ever could. I nodded politely and walked toward the garage refrigerator without correcting her. Maybe Chloe had only meant it as a joke. Maybe she thought it sounded younger or less complicated than explaining who I was. That was what I told myself while I carried another carton of drinks back toward the patio with trembling hands. But then I noticed the sign beside the welcome table. Mason's birthday celebration. Underneath, written in elegant gold script, were the words, "Hosted by Chloe and Daniel Harper." Nothing else. No mention of Grandma Evelyn. No acknowledgement of the woman who had planned every detail of this day while Chloe spent the past week posting spa photos on social media. I felt suddenly foolish remembering how excited I had been that morning while arranging the cupcakes into neat little rows. At 68 years old, I should have known better than to confuse usefulness with love. The party grew louder as the afternoon stretched on. Children screamed happily near the bounce house while parents gathered in little circles discussing summer camps and private schools. Every now and then someone handed me an empty tray or asked where the napkins were stored, assuming I worked there because no one corrected the story Chloe had created. Not even my own son. I finally spotted Daniel near the grill and walked toward him slowly, trying to ignore the tightness in my throat. "Daniel," I said quietly, "why is Chloe telling people I'm the babysitter?" For a second, he looked uncomfortable. His eyes flickered toward the guests before returning to me. Then he gave a small shrug. "Mom, don't make this into something bigger than it is. She's just trying to keep things simple." Simple. I stared at him while the sounds of the party blurred around me. Somewhere behind us, Mason laughed again, and Chloe lifted her phone to capture another perfect photo for the internet. I noticed then that every picture she took carefully avoided including me in the frame. I stayed until the last child left the backyard that evening. Long after the balloons had started to sag in the summer heat and the paper plates were stacked in crooked towers beside the trash bins, I was still there wiping barbecue sauce from folding tables while Chloe sat inside scrolling through her phone with her shoes kicked off on the couch. The sun had already disappeared behind the neighboring houses, leaving the yard washed in that soft gray light that always made me feel strangely lonely. Daniel carried a cooler into the garage without saying much to me. Every movement between us felt careful now, like we were both pretending not to notice something painful sitting in the middle of the room. Mason had fallen asleep upstairs after eating too much cake and running through sprinklers with his friends all afternoon. I was glad for that at least. Children should stay children for as long as they can. They should not have to learn how cruel adults can become. I gathered empty juice boxes into a trash bag and noticed one of the mothers waving goodbye from her driveway. "You did such a wonderful job today," she called warmly. They are lucky to have someone so dependable helping with childcare. I smiled automatically and thanked her because correcting people suddenly felt more exhausting than swallowing the humiliation whole. Inside the kitchen, Chloe was posting photos online before the party had even fully ended. I could see the glow of her screen reflected in the dark window above the sink. Every picture showed smiling children, perfect decorations, Daniel flipping burgers near the grill, and Chloe holding Mason beside the birthday cake. I was nowhere in any of them. Not one image showed the woman who spent hours hanging streamers from ladders with aching knees or frosting cupcakes at 1 o'clock in the morning because the bakery order had been canceled. I quietly washed the last tray while listening to Chloe laugh softly at something on her phone. "People are loving the pictures," she said to Daniel. "Jessica already asked who did the event planning." Daniel gave a tired nod and opened the refrigerator. "Well, it turned out nice. That was all. Not thank you. Not mom worked hard. Just nice." I dried my hands slowly and looked around the kitchen I had practically lived in since Mason was born. There was a time when Daniel used to call me every single day after work asking if I could help with the baby because Chloe felt overwhelmed. There were months when I stayed overnight in the guest room so they could sleep. I used to rock Mason in my arms at 3 in the morning while Daniel paced the hallway terrified he was failing as a father. Back then, Chloe introduced me differently. Back then, I was family. Somewhere along the way, that changed so gradually I almost did not notice it happening. The little exclusions came first. Family dinners I heard about afterward. Vacation photos where I was mysteriously missing. School events scheduled without telling me. Then came the smaller cuts. Chloe correcting Mason when he called me grandma too loudly in public. Chloe joking that I spent so much time at the house people probably thought I worked there. Everyone laughed, including me sometimes. That was the part one hated, most remembering later. How often I laughed just to keep peace inside the family. I picked up my purse near the back door and quietly slipped on my cardigan. Daniel glanced at me from across the kitchen. "You heading home?" he asked casually. Home. The word felt strange because suddenly I could not remember the last place where I had truly felt wanted. The drive home took 23 minutes, but it felt much longer that night. I kept both hands tight on the steering wheel while the radio played softly in the background, some old country song about family and small towns that only made the ache inside my chest heavier. Streetlights blurred across the windshield as I drove through neighborhoods filled with glowing kitchen windows and people settling into ordinary evenings. Somewhere along the way, I realized I could not remember the last time Daniel had hugged me goodbye. Not a quick side hug at the door or a distracted pat on the shoulder. A real hug. The kind children give their mothers before life teaches them to ration affection like money. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the porch light clicked on automatically, just as it always had. My little blue house looked exactly the same as it had for the past 14 years. Neat flower beds, white shutters, wind chimes swaying gently beside the front steps. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt painfully quiet. I carried my casserole dish inside and placed it on the counter without turning on the kitchen light. The silence wrapped around me immediately. No children laughing. No television upstairs. No Chloe talking loudly into her phone while pretending not to criticize someone. Just stillness. I opened my refrigerator and noticed the leftover frosting container sitting beside a gallon of milk. I had made extra buttercream because Mason loved sneaking spoonfuls while I decorated cakes. Last Christmas, he sat on this very counter wearing reindeer pajamas while I taught him how to pipe little stars on his sugar cookies. "Grandma makes everything taste better," he had whispered proudly after Chloe burned the first batch in the oven. I smiled at the memory for only a second before another thought replaced it. Chloe had not posted a single picture from Christmas with me in it either. I slowly sat down at the kitchen table and opened social media on my phone for the first time all day. Chloe had already uploaded an entire birthday album online. More than 40 pictures. Perfect lighting. Perfect smiles. Perfect family. I scrolled carefully through every image even though I knew I should not. There was Mason blowing out candles. Daniel lifting boxes near the garage. Chloe hugging guests beside the dessert table. One picture showed the backyard from above, taken from the upstairs balcony. I stared at it for a long moment because I was technically visible in the corner near the patio doors carrying a trash bag. My face was turned away. Anyone looking at the photo would assume I worked for the catering company. Thousands of people online would see those pictures and never know the truth. The comments underneath made something inside me slowly sink lower. "You are such an amazing mom, Chloe. Everything looks beautiful. Mason is lucky to have parents like you." Chloe replied to every compliment with little heart emojis and smiling faces. Not once did she mention me. Not once did Daniel correct it. I placed the phone face down on the table and stared out the dark kitchen window. That was when I finally allowed myself to admit something I had avoided for years. They were not slowly forgetting who I was. They were carefully rewriting me into someone easier to ignore. The next morning, I woke up at 6:15 out of habit, even though nobody needed me anywhere. For years, my mornings had revolved around other people, packing lunches, folding tiny socks warm from the dryer, driving across town before sunrise because Daniel had an early meeting or Chloe wanted to squeeze in another Pilates class before brunch. My body still remembered those routines even after the appreciation attached to them had disappeared. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window while the neighborhood slowly came to life around me. A sprinkler clicked rhythmically across the lawn next door. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and then stopped. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary lives. I wondered how many women my age sat alone in kitchens they once filled with family, slowly realizing they had become useful long before they became loved. My phone buzzed on the counter just after 7. For one foolish second, I thought it might be Daniel calling to apologize for the party. Instead, it was a calendar notification reminding me Mason had soccer practice that afternoon at 4:30. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone back down. Even the reminders in my life still assumed I belonged to that family in the same way I always had. I carried my coffee into the living room, where framed photographs covered the bookshelf beside the fireplace. Daniel at age 10 holding a fishing pole nearly taller than he was. Daniel graduating college in a navy cap and gown while his father stood proudly beside him with tears in his eyes. Mason as a newborn wrapped in the blue blanket I crocheted by hand during Chloe's difficult pregnancy. I moved closer to one picture taken 8 years earlier, not long after Mason was born. Chloe looked exhausted in the hospital bed, while Daniel sat beside her looking terrified and overwhelmed. I remembered that week clearly because they called me crying almost every night. Mason had colic so severe neither of them had slept more than 2 hours at a time. I practically moved into their guest room for 3 months. I cooked meals, sterilized bottles, folded laundry, and walked circles around the living room at 3 in the morning humming old lullabies while Mason cried against my shoulder. One night Daniel stood in the hallway, with red exhausted eyes and whispered, "I do not know what we would do without you, Mom." At the time, I believed him. I believed sacrifice built permanent places in people's hearts. I understand now that some people grow comfortable standing on the bridge while slowly forgetting who built it underneath them. Around noon, I opened the hall closet searching for an old photo album and accidentally knocked over a small plastic bin filled with school artwork Mason had made through the years. Construction paper cards spilled across the carpet. Finger paint turkeys. Crayon drawings. Handmade birthday cards folded unevenly by tiny hands. I picked one up slowly. Across the front, written in crooked second-grade handwriting, were the words, "I love my Grandma Evelyn because she always comes when nobody else can." I sat there on the floor staring at that sentence for a very long time, because children usually tell the truth before adults teach them how to rewrite it. 3 days passed before I heard from Chloe again. Not a thank you for planning the party. Not a message asking how I was doing. Just a short text arriving at 8:12 on Wednesday morning while I was watering the hydrangeas near my front porch. "Can you pick Mason up from soccer today? I have a hair appointment." I stared at the screen while water spilled slowly across the flower bed near my feet. No greeting. No please. Just expectation. As if my entire existence had quietly become a permanent unpaid service attached to their schedule. I typed a response 3 different times before deleting it. In the end, I simply wrote, "I cannot today." Her reply came less than a minute later. "Seriously? We are in a bind here." I looked down at the message and felt something unfamiliar settle inside me. Not anger exactly. Clarity. For years I had mistaken dependency for closeness. They needed me constantly, but needing someone is not the same thing as valuing them. I set the phone face down on the porch railing and finished watering the flowers without answering again. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, I drove myself to the small bookstore downtown instead of the soccer field. I wandered slowly between shelves for nearly an hour, touching book spines and listening to soft jazz playing overhead. Nobody needed anything from me there. Nobody expected me to carry trays or solve emergencies or disappear politely into the background. It felt strangely peaceful. I had just settled into a chair near the window with a coffee when my phone started ringing repeatedly inside my purse. Daniel, then Chloe, then Daniel again. I let it ring until finally a voicemail notification appeared. I listened to it while staring out at traffic moving slowly past the bookstore windows. Mom, where are you? Daniel sounded frustrated more than worried. Mason is still at the school field, and Chloe thought you were getting him. Coach Thompson has already called twice. I closed my eyes briefly. For a long moment, I simply listened to the silence after his voice ended. Not once in the message did he ask if I was all right. Not once did he wonder whether something might have happened to me. The only concern was inconvenience. I drove to the school 20 minutes later. The parking lot was nearly empty except for one minivan and Coach Thompson's truck near the baseball field. Mason sat alone on the aluminum bleachers with his soccer bag beside him, kicking gently at loose gravel with the toe of his sneaker. The second he saw my car, his face lit up with relief. "Grandma Evelyn," he shouted, running toward me before stopping suddenly halfway across the pavement. His expression shifted awkwardly, almost guilty. Grandma. My chest tightened at the hesitation hidden inside that tiny correction. Coach Thompson walked over carrying a clipboard under one arm. "I am glad somebody came," he said kindly. Mason said his grandmother usually handles pickup. Even strangers understood my role in that child's life more clearly than my own family seemed willing to admit. The ride back to Daniel's house was unusually quiet. Mason sat in the passenger seat hugging his soccer bag against his chest while the evening sun stretched long shadows across the dashboard. Normally after practice, he talked nonstop about goals, teammates, or snacks someone's parent had brought for the team. That afternoon, he barely spoke at all. I could feel him glancing at me every few minutes as if trying to measure my mood carefully. Children notice tension long before adults admit it exists. When we stopped at a red light near the grocery store, he finally looked down at his sneakers and asked quietly, "Are you mad at me?" The question hit me so suddenly I almost missed the green light changing. "Oh, sweetheart," I said softly, tightening my hands around the steering wheel. "Why would I ever be mad at you?" He shrugged without looking up. "Mom said you have been acting weird lately." I felt something cold move slowly through my chest. Not sharp anger. Something sadder than that. The kind of sadness that comes when you realize a child is being taught how to see you. I kept my voice calm. "Sometimes grown-ups get tired, Mason. That is all." He nodded slowly but did not seem convinced. A few minutes later, we pulled into Daniel's driveway, where Chloe stood near the garage holding her phone against one ear. The second she saw my car, she ended the call abruptly and walked toward us with tight, impatient steps. "Finally," she said under her breath before Mason had even climbed out. "Do you know how embarrassing this was?" Coach Thompson almost called emergency contacts. I looked at her quietly while Mason slipped past us carrying his bag into the house. "I never agreed to pick up today," I replied calmly. "I told you this morning I could not." Chloe crossed her arms. "Well, excuse me for assuming a grandmother would prioritize her grandson." The words were carefully chosen. Not loud enough for neighbors to hear, just sharp enough to leave a mark. Before I could answer, Daniel appeared in the doorway behind her. He looked exhausted already, loosening his tie with one hand while balancing a laptop bag with the other. "Can we not do this right now?" he muttered. It was a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. That word again. Everything painful in this family eventually became a misunderstanding once it inconvenienced them enough. Chloe shook her head dramatically and walked back toward the house. I swear, ever since the party, she has been so sensitive. Sensitive. I stood there, in the driveway, listening to my daughter-in-law reduce years of quiet sacrifice into emotional inconvenience. Daniel rubbed a hand across his forehead and sighed. "Mom, Chloe is under a lot of stress lately." I almost laughed at that. Stress. As if stress explained rewriting someone's place in a family until even a child hesitated before calling her grandma. But instead of arguing, I simply nodded once and handed Daniel Mason's water bottle through the open car window. "I think it is time you both start arranging other childcare options," I said gently. His expression changed instantly. Confusion first, then concern. Real concern this time. Not emotional concern for me. Practical concern. The kind people feel when a foundation beneath them suddenly shifts. "What does that mean?" he asked quickly. I looked past him toward the house where the kitchen lights glowed warmly through the windows. For years, I had mistaken access for belonging. I understand differently now. It means, I said softly, I am starting to remember I had a life before I became useful to yours. The changes started quietly after that conversation in the driveway. I stopped answering every call immediately. I stopped rearranging my schedule around emergencies that somehow only became emergencies when they affected Chloe and Daniel. The first Saturday I declined babysitting, Chloe sent 3 separate texts reminding me how disappointed Mason would be. I noticed none of them mentioned whether they cared if I was tired, hurt, or simply wanted a weekend to myself. It was always about convenience. Always about what role I failed to perform for them. So instead of driving across town at 7 in the morning with pancakes and extra clothes packed in my trunk like I usually did, I went to the farmer's market near the riverfront. I bought fresh peaches, listened to a local jazz band play beneath striped tents, and drank coffee slowly while watching strangers walk past. Nobody there knew me as somebody's babysitter. Nobody expected me to earn my place through usefulness. By noon, my phone had 14 missed calls. 2 from Daniel, 11 from Chloe, 1 from Mason using Chloe's phone. I stared at the screen for several seconds before finally listening to the voicemail Daniel had left an hour earlier. Mom, please call me back. Chloe had a work thing come up, and our sitter canceled last minute. Mason is upset because we promised him the science museum today. I sat there on a bench beside the river while boats drifted slowly across the water and realized something almost painful in its simplicity. They did not actually know how much of their lives rested on me until I stepped back far enough for them to feel the weight themselves. Later that afternoon, I finally called Daniel back. He answered immediately. Thank God, he breathed. Where have you been? Not how are you? Not are you okay? Just where have you been? I closed my eyes briefly. Out, I answered calmly. There was an awkward silence before he spoke again. Mom, you know we depend on you. Depend. The honesty of the word surprised both of us. For years we had hidden the arrangement beneath softer language. Family helping family. Grandma time. Bonding. But dependency was the truth underneath all of it. I looked down at my coffee cup resting between my hands. Daniel, I said quietly, do you know what Mason called me at soccer practice this week? He hesitated. What do you mean? He stopped himself before saying Grandma. He corrected it halfway through the sentence. Silence stretched across the phone line. I could hear traffic in the background wherever he was standing. Mom, he is a child, Daniel said finally. You are overthinking this. I almost smiled at that because minimizing pain had become his favorite survival skill. Ignore the discomfort long enough, and maybe it disappears on its own. But some things do not disappear. They settle quietly into the cracks between people until eventually the whole structure weakens beneath the weight. I spent years making your lives easier, I said softly. And somewhere along the way, all of you became comfortable treating my love like free labor. Daniel exhaled sharply. That is not fair. Fair. Another interesting word. I stared out across the river while the afternoon sun shimmered across the water like broken glass. No, I replied gently. I do not think it has been fair for quite some time. 2 weeks later, Daniel invited me to dinner. The message arrived unexpectedly on a quiet Thursday morning while I was trimming rose bushes near the side fence. Family dinner Sunday. Mason misses you. I read the sentence twice because the wording felt carefully chosen. Not we miss you. Mason misses you. Even now, affection arrived through obligation. Still, I agreed to come. Part of me wanted to see Mason. Another part wanted to know whether anything inside that family had truly changed. Sunday evening arrived warm and humid, the kind of late summer heat that made the air feel heavy even after sunset. Chloe had set the dining room table with expensive linen napkins and tall candles that smelled faintly like vanilla. Everything looked beautiful in the polished, staged way social media families always seem to look. Daniel greeted me with a quick hug at the door while Chloe smiled tightly and complimented my blouse with the same tone people use when speaking to distant coworkers. Mason was the only one who seemed genuinely happy to see me. He wrapped his arms around my waist immediately and whispered, I saved you a seat next to me. That simple sentence warmed something tired inside my chest. Dinner moved awkwardly at first. Chloe talked about a new marketing client. Daniel discussed work deadlines. I listened quietly while passing bowls of salad across the table and noticing how often both of them checked their phones between conversations. At one point, Chloe laughed while scrolling through something online and said, "Honestly, I do everything around this house. Sometimes I feel like I am raising two children instead of one." Daniel chuckled softly without looking up from his plate. I noticed Mason glance nervously between us. Then Chloe reached for her wine glass and added casually, "Although I guess I should not complain. At least we used to have built-in help." The room went still for half a second, just enough time for everyone to understand exactly what she meant. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mason stared down at his mashed potatoes. I set my fork down carefully beside my plate. "Built-in help, I repeated quietly. Chloe gave a thin smile. "Oh, come on, Evelyn. You know what I mean." Yes. I didn't know what she meant. That was the problem. For years, she had wrapped disrespect in humor until everyone became comfortable pretending cruelty was personality. I looked across the table at my son. "And what do you mean, Daniel?" He looked startled to suddenly be included. "Mom, do not do this tonight." "No," I said softly. "I think tonight is exactly the night for it." The candles flickered gently between us while silence spread slowly across the dining room. Then something unexpected happened. Mason pushed his chair back slightly and looked directly at Chloe. "Grandma is not help," he said quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed for a moment. Chloe's expression tightened instantly. "Mason, stay out of adult conversations." But he kept looking at her with frightened, determined eyes. "She is my grandma," he whispered. "And she always comes when nobody else does." I felt tears sting briefly behind my eyes, but I blinked them away before they could fall. Across the table, Daniel lowered his gaze toward his untouched dinner plate, like a man finally seeing the damage after pretending for years not to notice the cracks. Nobody said much after Mason spoke. The air inside the dining room felt heavy, almost fragile, like one wrong word might crack something permanently. Chloe picked up her wine glass again, but I noticed her hand trembling slightly now. Daniel kept staring at his plate, while Mason sat stiffly in his chair with his small hands folded tightly in his lap, as if he regretted speaking at all. I reached over quietly and squeezed his shoulder once. "Thank you for telling the truth," I said softly. Chloe let out a sharp breath through her nose. "This is exactly what I mean," she muttered. "Everything turns into drama." I looked at her calmly across the candlelight. For the first time in years, I did not feel the need to defend myself or smooth things over to keep peace inside the family. Peace built on silence is not peace at all. It is exhaustion. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "Mom," he began carefully, "nobody was trying to hurt you." I almost smiled at that because intention had become his favorite shield. As if pain only counted when somebody admitted planning it out loud. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked around the dining room one last time. The expensive chandelier, the polished hardwood floors, the family photos lining the hallway outside the kitchen. I noticed again how few of them included me anymore. Even memories had started excluding me before I fully realized it was happening. "You know," I said quietly, "when your father died, I promised myself I would spend the rest of my life helping the people I loved feel supported." Daniel's face softened slightly at the mention of his father. "And I did that," I continued. "Gladly. I drove carpools. I canceled vacations. I spent holidays cooking while everyone else sat comfortably at the table. I gave pieces of my life away because I believed that was what family meant." Chloe looked away first. Daniel stayed silent. "But somewhere along the way," I said gently, "all of you stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a function." Nobody argued because nobody could. The truth was sitting too clearly in the middle of the table now. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. Mason looked panicked immediately. "Grandma, are you leaving?" I smiled softly at him. "Yes, sweetheart. But not because of you." I leaned down and kissed the top of his head while breathing in the faint smell of grass and laundry detergent still clinging to his hair from soccer practice earlier. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope. I placed it carefully beside Daniel's plate. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "The paperwork for the educational trust one opened for Mason when he was born," I replied. Chloe looked startled. Daniel frowned and opened the envelope slowly. "I have been contributing to it for 8 years, I continued calmly. "Enough to cover college someday, if managed properly. But from now on, the account will be supervised directly through my attorney." Chloe's expression changed instantly. "Why would you do that?" I met her eyes evenly. "Because love should never require someone to disappear in order to deserve a place in the Family. Silence settled over the room again. Deep and final this time. I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door while nobody tried to stop me. Only Mason hurried after me across the hardwood floor. He wrapped his arms around my waist tightly before I reached the porch. "You are still my grandma," he whispered shakily. I held him close for a moment and closed my eyes against the ache rising inside my chest. "And you are still my boy," I whispered back. Then I stepped out into the warm night air, feeling strangely lighter than I had in years, because for the first time, I was no longer begging to be seen by people who had grown comfortable looking straight through me.